It's an election year, and once again refugees and asylum seekers are hot political issues. Here with me today is Associate Professor Jane McAdam from the Faculty of Law. Jane, you've been quite outspoken recently about these subjects, these topics. What are some of the misconceptions that are in debate at the moment as you see them?
Well, I think one of the biggest issues is that there's a lack of real information out there, particularly in a lot of the mainstream or popular media, about the numbers of people who are coming to Australia as asylum seekers, about the numbers of people who are living in the community as refugees, and about the conflation of some of these issues with topics like border security, national security, terrorism, and even the sustainable population debate that we're now having. I think that there's a perception that politicians and certain media outlets help to fuel, which is that refugees are somehow a threat to our security as a nation, and that we are being flooded, or as some opposition politicians have put it, we are facing a tsunami of refugees, and that's really just not borne out at all on the statistics. Australia accepts 0.6% of the world's refugee population. Each year we take in 13,750 refugees. And if you put that in the broader context of Australia's annual immigration intake, which is, depending on whether you include temporary migration as well, up to 200 plus thousand people a year. So we're talking about a very, very tiny percentage of that annual immigration intake as being comprised by refugees.
So, as you say, the public debate doesn't seem to be reflecting the facts. Why is that?
There are a number of reasons why that might be. I mean, one could be the ironic reason that precisely because the numbers are so small, politically they can be seen as a fairly easy trade-off. If you're going to try, as a Labor government, for example, if you want to try and stay in government, then what's a few thousand asylum seekers in the scheme of things if you can keep the seats that you might otherwise lose? I think that we've seen a real lack of leadership on the issue. Perhaps, I mean, certainly Gillard has tried, I think, to steer some of the rhetorical debate away from that very inflammatory language of queue jumpers and illegals and that sort of thing. But I'm concerned because I think she's replaced it with perhaps less inflammatory language, but damaging nonetheless, of irregular migration, as though somehow people are choosing to come here and not actually being pushed by serious human rights violations in their own countries and fear of persecution, which is the thing that leads people to seek asylum in the first place. So I think that lack of political leadership has meant that we're not having a very rigorous or well-grounded debate. I think that it's very easy to tap into geographical fears about Australia as an island nation that is surrounded by water and therefore open to attack, if you like. I think along with that comes some of the historical overtones. I mean, the White Australia policy, fears in the past of the yellow peril from the north. And while these aren't being stated, I wonder to what extent they underlie some of the latent racism and xenophobia that we might be seeing. And I think too this responds to the debate that Pauline Hanson kicked off a decade or so ago, where we saw the Howard government starting to respond to some of those concerns, and gradually that's made its way into the broader political debate.
It certainly does seem to be a perennial problem that Australia has in terms of the level of public debate on this issue. What are some of the facts that you would like to see more properly put?
Well, I think just about the numbers for a start. I mean, I'm sure if you polled people on the street, when you see on television sometimes, they say, oh, immigration's a serious concern, boat people, I'm really worried about that. If you actually said to them, and how many boat people do you think have arrived this year? And how many refugees do you think we have as a percentage of the total immigration intake? You'd get very inflated figures. As I say, I think the link that is now being made between refugees and population, the suggestion is that refugees are part of the population problem, that somehow they are creating the big Australia that the Gillard government no longer wants. And again, when you look at under 14,000 refugees we accept annually, of which only a few thousand have actually arrived on shore. The vast majority of people that we are resettling from refugee camps abroad. And again, that's one of the ironies. I suspect that the visual image, the optics of boats arriving uninvited to our shores is part of the problem. I think if you increased the political problem is what I mean. I think if you increase the number of refugees that we were to take in through resettlement programs, if you increase that tenfold, I wonder if there would be much concern about it, precisely because it would be relatively unknown, I suppose. I mean, it's not the same thing as seeing a boat arriving, as having people arriving by plane.
And even in terms of asylum seekers, the vast majority of asylum seekers who reach Australia don't come here by boat, do they?
That's right. No, the majority do come by plane. And the other thing too is that I think in terms of knowledge about what people are even fleeing from is one of the concerns. Certainly Howard exploited that after 9/11. The Tampa had arrived shortly before that, and he used 9/11 to somehow link terrorism and refugees, even though none of the people who were involved in 9/11 had ever sought asylum. And he seemed to suggest that perhaps people on the Tampa might be terrorists, when in fact they were fleeing the very regimes from which terrorists might come, and certainly the places where Australia has subsequently become involved in war.
Does your research show that other liberal democracies around the world have the same problem in terms of the level of political debate?
I think a lot of liberal democracies from time to time use asylum seekers and refugees as a bit of a scapegoat political issue, but I think the attention in Australia is vastly disproportionate to the numbers we're talking about. I mean, if you look at other countries like, if you look at Britain or the US or Germany, where you see several 100,000 asylum seekers arriving each year, and we're talking about, in terms of those who arrive spontaneously, 3,000 or 4,000 at most, and yet this dominates our election debates, it dominates front pages of the paper and the nightly news. I think in that sense it's completely overblown here and taken out of all proportions.
And of course Australia is a signatory to a number of UN international treaties. What are our obligations to asylum seekers?
Well, the main international law instrument is the 1951 Refugee Convention, which has a protocol from 1967 as well. And under those instruments, Australia is obliged not to send anyone back to a place where they would have a well-founded fear of persecution on account of their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or their membership of a particular social group. So, in other words, once you're outside your own country, and you need to be outside it to even claim protection, then if you reach a country that is a signatory to the Refugee Convention, that's the primary obligation, if you like, not to send somebody back. But that's not the extent of it. Along with that then means that if you're found to be a refugee, then that country owes you certain other obligations in relation to health, social security, education, access to courts and so on. And then that is bolstered by broader international human rights law, which applies to everybody irrespective of their immigration status.
So we have signed those agreements. So what of, at various times politicians' statements that, for example, we'll turn the boats back, or even the policy recently that we will freeze the claims of certain ethnic or nationalities.
Yep.
How do we justify that as a nation?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of factors at play here. One is that the international regime is something that I think governments often, that Australia, for example, has voluntarily ratified those instruments, and yet we sometimes hear statements that we won't be governed by people in Geneva or New York. We're Australians and only we know how the situation is here. That's based on a completely false premise, because these are international obligations we've agreed to and we're bound to respect. But I think what we saw with the Pacific solution, for example, was an attempt to oust the operation of that regime in the first place. And what I mean by that is that by preventing people from ever reaching Australia and a place where they can trigger the provisions of that convention. The point was to try and deter people, to try and intercept boats before they could ever get here, and then to place them in countries where they wouldn't have access to the domestic law provisions that are part of Australian law by excising territories from the Australian migration zone. The other thing too, which I haven't mentioned, is that under the law of the sea, the Navy has, or the state, but through the Navy, has various obligations such as safety of life at sea, which means that Abbott's claim that we can just turn the boats back, which he's had to come back on a little bit, is precisely because of the international law obligation not to allow people to drown at sea. I mean, you have an obligation to do certain things in certain parts of your waters, and simply turning boats back and paying no attention to the safety of the life of people on those boats would be contrary to international law.
I guess what I'm getting at is it seems that the international law is quite clear, and we've agreed, we've signed up to these laws, but then domestically a political imperative seems to take over.
Yeah.
How do you make a differentiation between the politics and the international law?
Some people say that international law is really just all about international politics as well, and the two are necessarily entwined. And I think to some degree that's true, but I think you're right that we have clear normative frameworks in international law that set out the parameters of what's, what Australia has agreed to do, what the boundaries are in terms of what it can do. While they are clear to an extent, the Refugee Convention, for example, says nothing on the actual way in which people have to be processed. And so I think sometimes the unspoken bits of the law get used to really test out the boundaries, how far can we take it? And so, for example, the idea that you would turn parts of Australia into not Australia for the purposes of immigration law would never have been in the minds of the drafters of any of those international treaties, and as I suggested, is a way of really trying to prevent the law from ever being triggered in the first place. And the problem is that in international law you can't create voids that are simply not part of a territory. You might do that domestically, but Australia can't get out of its international obligations no matter what it tries to do. But what it has tried to do, and this comes back to your example of stopping the processing of certain national groups, is it tries to, if you like, suspend the application of the law, which again I would argue is contrary to the very object and purpose of an instrument like the Refugee Convention. I mean,
but it highlights a very important problem with international law. Some people would argue is that without effective sanction, how can you actually encourage or enforce those laws?
And again, I think this is where international law is very strong on principle, but sometimes quite weak on delivery, because even when you have an international treaty regime, the problems then come down to ratification of the treaties. Well, at least we have that here, but then enforcement and oversight of the treaties. And the UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, has a supervisory role over the Refugee Convention, but there's no international refugee court, if you like, to which disputes can be referred. In theory, the International Court of Justice is the place that one government could take another government to dispute some area of international refugee law, but that's never happened, and I think politically it probably never will. But there are other potential avenues that asylum seekers have sometimes gone to at the international arena in the past. For example, the Human Rights Committee, where Australia was complained against many times about having mandatory detention and the human rights abuses that occurred there. But again, enforcement is the issue. While the Human Rights Committee has condemned Australia for those practices as being contrary to international human rights law, ultimately all it can do is express its views, and there's no international police force that's going to round up the Australian government to,
So therefore the most effective sanction then is more or less a name and shame approach. And I guess academics such as yourself speaking out in the media achieves something of that objective, does it?
Well, one would hope so. I'm not sure how effective it is, but I guess the thing I think is that I'm fortunate to be in an independent position where not only do I have the ability, but I would argue I have a moral obligation to do that where I see breaches of the law occurring or potential breaches of the law occurring. And so, for example, with the regional processing centre that was mooted by the Prime Minister in talking about having a regional processing centre in East Timor, there are issues I think that really need to be raised there, such as who's going to be in charge of this, who's going to have ultimate responsibility, who's going to ensure that people's human rights are respected while they are being held there. Are they going to be in mandatory detention? Are they going to have rights to work? Who's going to review those decisions? And what happens to the people who are found to be refugees? Are they going to be held there in limbo for decades, which is a situation unfortunately we have at the international level already? Or will Australia have a commitment to resettle people here? And as I say, I think that, I don't see myself as being a lobbyist or anything like that. In fact, I think that would be quite contrary to my role as an academic. But I do think that I'm in a position where I can speak out freely and try and highlight some of these issues in an impartial and kind of reasoned way, supported by the research that I and others have done.
And this area of public law that you deal with, because it is so public, there is a fine line, isn't there, between your role as an academic and perhaps becoming an advocate for a certain issue. And you're comfortable with that dual role?
I certainly have boundaries where I feel what I feel is appropriate and what I'm comfortable doing. I think there are some academics who take a much more active role in the media than I feel comfortable with doing, and that's not necessarily to do with the advocacy so much as where I feel I can make a meaningful contribution and what I want the extent of that contribution to be. So for me, it's about trying to bring the research, the information that I know to be accurate into that public space, and to try and be part of a debate or an analysis of the issues that can help to inform and I actually think that's a large part of it in this forum, is simply to get some of the information out there, and also some understanding for people in the community for whom this might be a scary issue because they actually aren't equipped with the information. And I actually think one of the other factors that can really help people to understand is when they have the opportunity to meet with refugees and realise that these are people who have been born into parts of the world that are often, are always much more unstable than Australia. And as Australians, or as immigrants to Australia, we're very fortunate to be in a country where we haven't seen those sorts of human rights violations and people literally being scared for their life.
Okay, and some of the issues to date, offshore processing we've mentioned before. Is that a policy that's going to work? I mean, some people have claimed that will even encourage more asylum seekers to Australia, or to that regional asylum centre.
It really depends on how it's done. I mean, I can't see at present how the sort of offshore processing centre that's being talked about, how that would actually stop boats, or certainly stop people smugglers at least getting as far as Indonesia or Malaysia if there's an agreement from those countries to then move people to East Timor or wherever it might be to an offshore processing centre. It also depends on what domestic law is going to operate, what's going to govern the processing there, and what the commitments of other countries are in terms of resettling refugees. I think that people are risking their lives by getting on boats and coming to Australia, and that's a serious problem. But people aren't making that decision lightly. I mean, that to me is a sign of desperation, because either people are fleeing directly from that persecution, or they are trying to find a way to actually get protection and to get a meaningful solution, rather than being, if they even have the option to go to a refugee camp, rather than staying there and waiting for years and years for resettlement that may never come. And actually that's one of the other myths, that this idea that there's a queue in refugee camps and that people who come by boat are jumping that queue. The queue is non-existent, in the sense that you don't arrive on 1st of May 1985 and when it's your turn you get resettled. It's got nothing to do with the chronology of arrival. It's all to do with what the resettlement officers perceive as the most vulnerable cases or the most deserving cases, what the country caseload makeup is at the time that someone from the immigration department goes to the camps and looks at who the resettlement cases are. Many of those decisions are coming from Canberra about what our refugee resettlement population is going to look like. And so that idea of a queue is really a great myth.
I mean, it's obviously a very complicated issue. What's your feeling? Is it possible to have a properly informed public debate about these things, or is it just too complicated for most people?
I think some of it is very complicated, but I think there are some fairly basic issues that could be highlighted in a way that would dispel some of the fear that allegedly exists in the community. And that's where I think you need real political leadership. Whether we can have that in Australia at the moment, I don't know. I mean, I'm not terribly hopeful, having seen the advertisements that are already running for the election campaign, where the message is put in such blunt terms that no wonder we haven't got the space there to have a proper and informed debate. But I would like to be optimistic and hope that at some point in the future we can.
Okay, well, it's not an issue I think that's going to go away.
No.
Okay. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.